welcome to everyone here. And I know I've gotten many calls from Tougaloo College alumni. And I know I see one person, a student of Dr. Morrison, a former student, Attorney William Rice. So why don't you stand, Attorney Rice? Any other Tougalooans in the room? Yeah. They're coming. Right. But again, I'm so happy to sponsor a major lecture on globalization, which is a part of what the political science department has branded as a Houston Ideas Fair. We have had many programs. We continue to do programs. In the spring, we're going to do something called Kids in Houston. We will look at demographic changes and also electoral trends and where African Americans and other stakeholders in the city of Houston. So this is just one of many programs to come under the heading of what we call Houston Ideas Fair or / Festival. I'm going to ask one of my staffers, Severe Lab, to come forward and to give you an introduction because her role in the political science department is to put together our international component of the public administration program, also for undergraduate students in political science. And she is the study abroad coordinator. And Severe, I think, is more than fitting because she has established a very good working relationship with both of our guests here this evening. Dr. K.C. Morrison, you will hear more about him, and he is my former professor, but actually he established the relationship that we have as a university, particularly in the School of Public Affairs, with both Brazil and also Africa. So at this time I'm going to ask Severe to come up and just give an introduction and also just some words of gratitude. Thank you for what Dr. Morrison and also Dr. Williams has done for our program.
Hello everyone, good evening, happy Friday. Thank you for coming. Dr. Williams, so we've been working with Dr. Williams for, I think, about almost 4 years now, when we first started the Study Abroad program, which is part of the Executive Online Masters in Public Administration program. And the reason why we were able to make that connection was because Dr. Adams' mentor, who is Dr. Morrison, helped us make that connection, both with Dr. Williams and then also our contact in Brazil. So we've been able to build a very successful study abroad program as a result of these relationships. And we've been able to really allow and help our students build very strong connections with the African diaspora through traveling to Ghana, working in service learning, having an opportunity to engage in service learning, learn about the contributions and relationships that have been built and forged even before our time, looking at people like W.B. Du Bois, who is laid to rest in Ghana, having a stronger understanding about leaders across the African diaspora through people like Kwame Nkrumah. And so it has really been through Dr. Williams and Dr. Morrison that we've been able to really do some amazing things. So I would like to say thank you to both of you. We're glad that Dr. Williams could come today. We're very happy that Dr. Morrison could be here, and we hope that you enjoy the lectures and engage in discussion as well this evening. So thank you.
Okay, the format for this evening's programs, I will ask both of our lecturers to come up and give a presentation for about 30 minutes. And then I'm going to ask one of my former students and also now an adjunct professor, Sheridan Swartz, and she's going to conduct what we call a question and answer session, and then we'll have questions from the audience. At this time, Dr. Williams, please.
Great. Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. It's quite a pleasure to be here at TSU, to even, I guess, be in Texas. I've never been to Texas before, so that's quite exciting. But it's more exciting to be here. I've been with the TSU family in Ghana, but never here in Texas, so it's quite an experience, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I believe our topic today has to do with globalization, and I think Brazil and Africa. And of course, globalization is real. And what I'd like to do in the time that I have is to somehow tie in the Ebola crisis because it has everything to do with globalization. And so I want to try to look at it in that context, but also within the context of how it points to the crisis of what I call the crisis of Pan-Africanism. Almost all the major challenges that we face on the continent, even as a people, really require continental action, coordination, integration, unity. But the crisis that we have with Ebola really points to the fact that we're lacking seriously along lines of integration, unity, and coordination on the continent of Africa. And so that's how I'd like to proceed. Now, globalization, of course, is quite, it affects everyone on the planet. As Prof. Morrison was saying earlier when we were walking in the hall, it's not anything new. It has roots that go quite deep. But it's become quite an intense phenomenon, honestly, because of technology and, of course, commerce and market forces have really served to accelerate the globalization. The problem for us is that, or problem for anybody facing globalization, is that if you lack the economic, technical, and industrial strength to manage globalization, the demands of globalization, you're going to suffer. In other words, the effects of globalization are not symmetrical. They're rather asymmetrical. The effects are the benefits. You can benefit from globalization if you're strong, economically, technologically, industrially, but you'll suffer, you'll become the victim of it if you lack those resources. In Africa, African people, I think, are the victims of globalization because we lack the unity and coordination and integration. Kwame Nkrumah once said that Africa must unite or perish. It sounds a bit hyperbolic, but it's real. Honestly, that's how I see it, that we either unite or perish on the continent. And so what I would like to do is to talk about globalization within, or the Ebola crisis within that context, and try to underline the importance for the continent of Africa to unite. Because there are a number of problems, major problems that the continent is faced with, Ebola being one. But if you look at all those major problems, they are continental. They are continental, including the Ebola crisis. I mean, after all, the monkey or the bat or whatever wild animal in the bush that's causing this disease doesn't need a visa or resident permit or work permit or green card to go from one forest to the next. It just moves all around. It's probably a bat, based on what the research is suggesting. But those bats, they're in colonies. They're huge colonies, and they just move all over the continent. They can be in the Congo one season, and 3 or 4 or 5 months, they mix with other colonies, and then they're in West Africa, which is basically what happened. We have them in Accra. I don't know if you, 37. It's a huge colony of fruit bats in Accra. But it has everything to do with globalization. And we've been the victims of it. Because after all, so much wealth in Africa is being siphoned, has been siphoned from Africa to develop the industrial countries for centuries. Beginning, of course, with the most important human resource, and that's human beings. But after that, of course, Africa's wealth, mineral wealth now is just constantly being siphoned. So it's all this money, all millions and billions and trillions of dollars that we don't receive because of our position within the global community. We, of course, suffer from neo-colonialism in Ghana, in Africa. And it's a huge problem. Our mineral resources leave, but they leave unfinished. They leave with no value added to them. And so you lose millions and billions of dollars. So how can we have money to pay for hospitals and doctors and nurses and lab technicians? We don't have the money. It's all leaving. If you look at Liberia, for example, in 2012, $200 million was earned from rubber. You know, Liberia is a major source of rubber. I think you know Firestone and the like. 200 million. That's about 40% of Liberia's exports. But that's the next year, two of the major recipients of that rubber, Bridgestone, I think you've heard of Bridgestone, major tire, earned $27.4 billion. Michelin, $25.5 billion. Totaling almost $53 billion. Liberia gets $200 million. It's not even a fraction of the money. So where is Liberia going to find money? Not to mention the war in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We could do every state on the continent and it'd be the same. Ghana's no different. Ghana, people keep talking about the great success story, but where's the success? Honestly, Ghana is a major producer of bauxite, but it imports aluminum. It's a major producer of manganese, but it imports stainless steel. Ghana has been producing gold for centuries, and we don't refine gold in Ghana. So it's a problem. For example, 1 ton of bauxite in the global market attracts about $45. But that same ton can produce $350 worth of aluminum. So that's what we face with. So where are the doctors? Liberia has 1 doctor to 14,000 people. Imagine. This is before Ebola. This is before Ebola. 1 doctor per 14,000 people. Now, the WHO, World Health Organization, recommends the approved rate to be about 1 to 600. The U.S. has about 1 to 390. Liberia, 1 to 14,000. Before Ebola started killing the few, maybe less, almost a little over 200 doctors, many of whom have died. So how do you face something? So it's a problem, and so Ebola should be understood in that context. Again, it's not just obviously Liberia, not just Sierra Leone, not just Guinea. It has to do with health care, the public health care sector, which has not been developed in Africa. So with the global community responding in the way that it has, it again underlines the importance for Pan-African integration. We can start with the media. Where is the African Media House to counter all the media misinformation and hysteria that's been spread around the Ebola disease? Honestly, I follow it every day. I follow it in the morning, afternoon, evening, because it affects me directly. I've gotten so many cancellations. People are not coming to Ghana. Now, Ghana's no recorded case. There's no Ebola in Ghana. And you can't get Ebola through, I don't know, osmosis or some kind. You can't get it unless, we have no record, but people are not coming because the media, this is part of globalization, paints Africa with 1 brush. Early on, they were saying it was some small town in Liberia where the bodies of Ebola victims were laying in the ground. And the media said, Casey, a body of Ebola victims are being laid in West Africa, on the streets of West Africa. 1 town. But this is the media for you. This is what happens, and leaves a lot of hysteria. There was even one article I remember saying that the Ebola disease could mutate into airborne disease. There's been no non-airborne disease that's ever mutated to become airborne, never in the history. But somehow now Ebola has that potential, just to promote the fear, because the media. But I don't mean to blame other communities, because honestly, why hasn't Africa pooled its resources and created its own media house to tell its own story? For example, Nigeria has become Ebola-free. That's a great story, but it's just one little small article on it that I saw. A population, as you were saying, Casey, 180 million. We were all afraid. They use social media. They use all kind of IT technology, different apps, and control. Same with Senegal. The one Guinean who came to Senegal, they sent him back as a survivor. But again, you don't hear about it. So the media is real problem. So the impact, of course, is major. Not just hotels, not just tourism, but tourism is very serious, because in Ghana, for example, tourism is the fastest growing industry. It's the fastest growing export exchange earner, honestly. But I read even Kenya and South Africa has been affected. It's tourist trade. Imagine tourism trade. Imagine. Kenya and South Africa, so far removed from West Africa. So it's a problematic. The only really major actor that's done so well, in my opinion, is Cuba. Honestly, they behaved very responsibly, as they've always done. Little tiny Cuba, 11 million people, sending almost 500 doctors, medical workers to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. 165 has already arrived in Sierra Leone, and another 296 are soon to arrive in Liberia and Guinea. I don't know why the U.S. is sending 4,000 military troops to these countries. I mean, come on, the military, they train to kill, unless I'm misunderstanding something. Because to build these clinics, I mean, these are not some major clinics, these are just makeshift structures. The Liberians themselves in Sierra Leone, they can build these clinics. Why 4,000 troops, military troops? And if you have money, you want to do something, just send money for sanitation and water and fuel, electricity to get to. That's what is missing in Liberia. They don't have running water. They don't have pipe-borne water in Liberia. They don't have 24/7 electricity. And they need more doctors and nurses and lab technicians and pharmacists. That's what they need. An Ebola patient needs 24/7 care. His liquids have to be checked, his organs, liver, and all these things you have to be. And in Africa, you don't get that kind of care. A doctor will come and see you in the morning, and maybe he'll see you the next morning. That's pretty much health care in much of sub-Saharan Africa. Because the doctors and nurses, they just leave. In Ghana, almost every night, a nurse or a doctor is leaving the country. Honestly. And the sad thing is that health care in Ghana is very heavily subsidized. They just leave because they just can't be paid the money. They have to work 2 and 3. They can't just work at one hospital, no. So we need more medical doctors. Again, I cannot emphasize the importance of what Cuba's done. A country of 11 million people. But this is what they do. Cuba sends about 50,000 of its medical doctors around the world, 66 countries. Cuba trains 20,000 foreigners to be doctors and nurses and lab technicians and pharmacists, largely for free. This is, again, if we talk about a neighbor within the global village that behaves well and sets the standard, that's Cuba. I can't stress it enough. You may recall that Cuba was prepared to send a team of medical workers to Louisiana for the Katrina. And of course, Bush rebuffed him, told him, we don't need you. So this is the problem. And again, we don't want to just talk about what's going on in the global community and what's not going on. Race and class seems to be a big issue with the Ebola. It's part of the global problem, race and class. And this young man, relatively young man who died recently at Duncan, is it Thomas Derek Duncan? It seemed like he didn't get the same treatment. Maybe it's too early yet. Maybe the jury is not back yet, but and I follow this thing carefully. He just doesn't seem to get the same treatment. I stand corrected. But this ZMAP that those other 2 white people received, it's hard for me to believe that it's finished. I can believe a lot. I can believe in tooth fairies. I can believe in unicorns, but I'm sorry. That's hard to believe. You just made some medicine for 2 people. And then the blood transfusions that the other guy received. They claim that this Dr. Brantley, Kent Brantley, called the doctor in Dallas to say, I can offer my blood, because if it seems to be some success with receiving the blood of Ebola survivors. But his blood type didn't match. That's what they're saying. But there's so many Ebola survivors. There's so many Ebola survivors. We in the media, we don't hear about it. you can get the blood and send it here. But for me, call me sensitive or paranoid, but it seemed like, and his family seemed to be suggesting that as well. Here again, if you lack the economic, technical, industrial strength, you will become the victim of globalization. But I want to spend some time in closing on trying to emphasize this question of African unity and African integration by looking at some other examples to show that unless we unite, we have the potential of perishing. It sounds hyperbolic, but I don't think so. So I just want to mention a few and then turn things over to Prof. I've already mentioned the Ebola problem. You know, why haven't the African leaders by now established major super medical centers throughout the continent, at least in the region? We have 5 regions in Africa. These leaders who've siphoned so much of the wealth, you know, when they get sick, they go straight to Brussels or Paris or London or somewhere. But why haven't they thought about creating, at least in the region, some healthcare centers? And why is there no network of healthcare crisis response network? I mean, why? Because there's so much interaction going on throughout these sub-regions on the continent. I mean, if you look at the map, you'll see Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Senegal. They're just like that, and they move to and fro. So there are all sorts of infectious diseases. So a response network should have been in place, but why is it not? Especially, again, this bush meat, it just moves around. In fact, if we can just, again, talk briefly about just deforestation as a factor. These commercial, insatiable interests of the industrial countries around the world are causing our continent to lose its forests. And so it's no accident why human beings are in closer contact with these wild bush animals. You know, years ago, decades ago, Africa's forest was widespread, tropical rainforest, but that's not the case now. And human beings and these wild animals are in close contact. And that's a real problem. It's a problem not only for the potential of catching diseases, but it, of course, affects global warming. Global warming is 1,000 times more serious than Ebola. Ebola will eventually be solved. But the problem with the global warming is even more severe. And because of these fossil fuels, we need the forests. But it's being decimated. And so to solve the problem, deforestation, the problem with these animals, of course, we can't do it separately. But let's, again, end with some other examples. In other words, the point I'm making is that the major problems, the major challenges facing Africa require a continental response. We could talk about food, agriculture. Africa, of course, doesn't feed itself. I mean, that's amazing. Even though Africa is mostly arid, semi-arid, after all, the Sahara Desert, I mean, the whole United States can fit inside the Sahara Desert. So Africa is arid, semi-arid in the southwest. But despite that, because it's so big, 11.5 million square miles, Africa has 632 million hectares of arable land. 632 hectares of arable land. And a hectare is 2.5 acres, just to give you an idea. But only up around 179 million hectares are being used. Less than a third. Not a problem in and of itself, but you should know that the majority of African agricultural land is rain dependent. And if the rain gods don't favor us, we're in trouble. So how can a continent that has that much arable land not feed itself? Ghana doesn't feed itself. If you come to Ghana, I mean, you guys who've been to Ghana, you know it's just nothing but land to grow food. In my own backyard, I have an orange tree, a banana tree, cinnamon tree, avocado. You just throw the seeds down, Casey, and just, pamper and water them. I mean, that's how well. But Ghana doesn't feed itself. Ghana imports about $300 million a year of rice. The problem with agriculture in Africa will be solved when the continent unites. Less than 5% of African land is irrigated. You will never become agriculturally sufficient if you can't irrigate the land. And Africa has so much water. Imagine all the large water bodies. Imagine the Nile, the Zambezi, the Orange River, the River Congo, and the River Niger. Each river bordering several countries. The Nile has bordered by about 10 countries, stretching 4,126 miles. It's longer than the United States. How can you be starving? Let me read something for you about from the Congo. It's amazing, from the Washington Post some few years ago. Because now that's 632 million hectares of arable land. 40% of it is in four countries in Africa. That's Nigeria, the two Sudans, and the Congo. The Congo can feed the whole Africa, 1 billion people. But unless the continent integrates and you can't do it. No, should the Congo try to do it? This is the Congo. Congo has the agricultural potential to feed the whole of Africa, but translating that potential into reality would take a concerted effort on the part of policymakers. The Congo has a vast unrealized agricultural capacity. Straddling the equator and spanning 2 tropical zones, its climate favors the cultivation of a wide range of tropical and even Mediterranean crops. More than half of the DRC's land is arable and suitable for farming. However, it is estimated that only 1 to 2% of the nation's farmable territory has so far been under cultivation at any one time. 1 to 2%. Congo, of course, is always being attacked from outside, from times immemorial. Coffee beans, potatoes, and leeks can be produced in the high plains of the east and south. The cool temperature and fertile soil of the eastern highlands favor the cultivation of tomatoes, sweet potatoes, yam, and pumpkins, and even Mediterranean vegetables such as artichokes and asparagus. So high is the agricultural yield that it is not uncommon when the rainy season is very long to replant immediately after harvest and get a second crop during the same season. Look at it, one country can feed the whole Africa, but yet people are starving in Africa. No one country can do it. You have to work together. It's the same with power, electricity. Africa is mostly in the dark. But just this one Congo River, which has the second largest volume of water in the world after the Amazon River, can produce 150,000 megawatts of power. That's 3 times Africa's current capacity. Should the Congo try to do that alone? When in fact it can electrify almost 3/4 of Africa's. So agriculture, electricity, irrigation, even the military challenges facing the continent. Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. These guys aren't interested in just Nigeria, just Somalia. No, not at all. You can't, unless you organize and integrate and unify, you won't be able to defeat these groups. That's just another example. Poaching. It's a big problem in East Africa, Southern Africa. Here again, the wildebeest, or the elephant, and these other animals that earn lots of money. I mean, it's a major source of revenue for countries in East and Southern Africa. They're not isolated in one particular state. They move all around. And these poachers, our income that comes from these poachers often finance these terrorist groups. So even to solve the problem of poaching, I mean, millions of tons of ivory from the elephants. Some of these species will be, the white rhino, will be eliminated. But you just can't solve it with one country. You can look at the problems on our coastal areas, the sea, our relationship with the sea, be it in the east or the west or in the south. They have major problems, but you can't solve them unless there's integration, unity, coordination. In the Gulf of Guinea, we have piracy. We have overfishing, unregulated fishing. These large shippers come from South Korea and Japan and take the fish, leaving a very tiny fish left for the African fishermen. drug trafficking, marine border conflicts, marine pollution. All these problems cannot be solved by any one country. The Gulf of Guinea is all that. How can you solve the problem? They got to come together to solve the problem. One of the things they would need is satellite, what do you call the thing? Satellite technology, where they can see what's going on. There's a word for it. I seem to be missing. It's very expensive. But if they pool their resources, they can solve the problem. Even the landlocked countries in Africa, it's about 20 countries in Africa that are landlocked. Unless Africa unites, how will these countries have access to the sea? And believe you me, you don't develop without access to the sea. If you don't think the sea is so important, just study the U.S. The U.S. wanted no country in between it and the sea. In fact, if the Canadians didn't quickly federate, you look at it, was a congressional, what do you call it, congressional legislation that was passed by the Congress to federate Canada. Honestly. Yeah, that's what the Louisiana Purchase was about. That's what the purchase of Florida was about. It's not a criticism, you just need it. You find, you'd be hard pressed. Look at some of the countries that have access to the sea. USA, Germany, UK, France, Italy, Japan, China, Canada, Spain, Portugal, Russia, Brazil, India, South Korea, Argentina, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Poland, Finland, Greece, Turkey, Austria, and you go on and on. All these countries have immediate access to the sea. You know, man just came from Missouri some time ago. Missouri is landlocked, but it's not really landlocked. It has access to the sea because it's part of a country that has access to the sea. You have to really experience countries that don't have access, like Burkina Faso. They suffer, especially when there's some war. So here again, African integration, African unity is necessary. Even paper, we don't import, we don't produce paper. Okay, see, anywhere other than maybe one or two places, South Africa, maybe somewhere else, in Africa. Imagine, paper. Paper, I'm talking paper. Despite all the trees being felled, we don't produce paper, we import paper. I have a children's book that's over there. They produce it in India. One of my hobbies, I write children's books. It's produced in India. Because they got paper mills, and we import paper. Well, paper, you need river, you need water. All these water bodies. And it's capital intense. Why not pool your resources? The River Niger, can't some of the countries, the River Niger, pool their resources and create a paper mill? So we could go on and on. I don't mean to belabor the point. This is what I'm referring to as the crisis of Pan-Africanism. The continent has to unite. It has no choice. Fortunately, we have the AU there. It's better than nothing. It's better than the OAU. But they're moving at a snail's pace, partly because the leaders don't have a big incentive to make it happen. The leaders of Africa, they're wealthy. They live in really large. And they don't really care so much. They're doing it maybe out of, I don't know what, some sense of responsibility, but they don't feel the urgent need to get it done. Not like Kwame Nkrumah and some of the others. For Nkrumah, I mean, that was his passion. That's why at the headquarters in the Addis Ababa of the AU, only Nkrumah's statue is there. If I was a tomato producer, farmer, I'd see the need for it. I'm in Ghana making tomatoes, but I can't sell them because we importing all the tomato paste. It's only United Africa can protect its infant industries. Protection is critical. You can't find any country that's developed without protection. And they still protect. They might not call it that, but what's Shakespeare? A rose, yeah, by any other name. It still smells the same. It's nothing but protection. When China reduces the value of its currency, it's protecting its exports. When the U.S. subsidizes its farmers, and it's just protection. That's all it is. So this is our problem. And it affects Africans everywhere, wherever you are. For me, Thomas Derrick Duncan was a victim of this problem. You could be from Liberia, you could be from Haiti, you could be from wherever. Let me conclude by talking, I hope the time is okay. Are we okay? I don't want to go over, I don't want to go under either. I have to watch. Are we okay? What's the 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay, the diaspora. Let me conclude with that's a problem. Again, I'm studying this thing carefully. I don't see any real response from the diaspora like I think we should see. Honestly. And by the African diaspora, I mean it's two parts of the African diaspora. We got those who are the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, most of us here, I guess. That's, I don't know, 300-400 million. But then we have, migrants from all over the continent who've migrated to the industrial countries in Europe and the U.S. Those who were maybe born in Africa but migrated to these places, or their children. I learned there's about 1 million, I just learned there's 1 million Nigerians in Houston. Yeah, Houston. So that's a huge community. We should hear about all the work being done to deal with this problem of Ebola. It's a serious, it's a serious problem. And this is how we should respond. That's part of the crisis of Pan-Africanism. This is what Marcus Garvey taught us, Malcolm X taught us, that if Africa's not free, the rest of us will never be free. It's not possible. It's unthinkable. It can't happen. You can make progress, but you'd never be totally free. So we need these type of efforts. I mean, goodness, the diaspora spends billions of dollars, or sends billions of dollars to Africa, especially that second group of diasporans. I mean, it's the remittances, you should be aware, but it's not earmarked. Why can't the AU, since the diaspora is one of the 6 regions of the AU, East, West, South, North, Central, and the diaspora, it's an official region of the AU. Why can't the AU, earmark that money and say, look, look, it's going here, it's going to be transparent, this is what it's going to be used for, roads, healthcare, education. Because billions of dollars, honestly, every year from the African diaspora of migrants or descendants of migrants are going there, but it's not really being done. One of the beautiful moments of this type of unity that I'm suggesting is when an earthquake in Haiti occurred. I don't know if you caught it, but the president of Senegal at the time, he's called Wade, I think, Wade. He offered land and anything you need, any Haitian who found his way to Senegal, he just said, it's a red carpet. When, a few years ago when Haiti had that, that's what we're talking about. And that was a beautiful gesture, and this is what has to be done. So let me end there and thank you guys for listening.
Well, to Professor Adams and his staff, who are always so generous and so efficient in arranging things for me when I am in Houston, I'm delighted to be here. And I'm delighted to see some Tuvaluans in the office, in the building. I want to talk about this same, but there's a great deal of symmetry between our thinking about this process of globalization. And I want to think about it or to invite you to think about it, because I just want to make some suggestive comments here and perhaps invite some exchange with you about the comments that Michael Williams has made and some of the things I will suggest. So I'd like to think about globalization from the beginning, at least insofar as it relates to the African continent and to African descendants. And I think we can set this beginning, at least for the purposes in which we're talking this evening, we can set it in two important moments in the history of Africa's relationship with the Western world, or at least with the European world. And those two moments are enslavement and colonization. And so if there's a kind of theme running through this, I'm really talking about what is the peril and promise of globalization. Professor Williams has already suggested that there are things to be gained from this process of globalization, but it's always fraught with certain kinds of dangers. And so I want to talk a little bit at these two things. By looking at the residual and ordinary effects of African confrontation with or encounter with Europeans. In the way I have sort of timed this, it begins with enslavement. We shouldn't forget that the first time Europeans relate to Africans in a major way, it is in a process of enslavement. And that is followed, once they got done with that, decided that the economic benefits of that system were no longer available. Then they moved to the land, and that relationship involved the occupation of the land. First they depopulated the continent, a depopulation from which Africa's never recovered. And then they occupied the land and set up a series of relationships that have endured, some of which have been beneficial, but most have not. Largely because, in the first instance, enslavement, Africans were rendered as property, and then in the second instance, the most vital part of what contributes to growth and development of human beings anywhere is the possession of some land and reaping the benefits of the things that grow from it. And so first these elements of property were removed, and then the very sort of basis for human development and growth was occupied by Europeans. Well, the sort of end, so that I would describe as essentially peril. There is almost nothing about the enslavement of Africans that was promising for the African continent. There was almost nothing about the occupation of the land that was promising for the African continent, so that too was perilous. We will see along the way that there were some residual ways in which it was not, but for the most part it represented peril. How did we get out of those two moments, or how did we move along from those two moments? Enslavement ended, we all know, at some point in time, although in Brazil it ended almost just yesterday. It's almost 1900 when it ends in Brazil, but it ended. Colonization ended, at least the pure occupation of the land ended. At some point, shortly after the Second World War, it ended. So what happens that resolves these two major perilous moments for Africans? Well, they get something called independence. But they get it, for the most part, not by fighting their way. They don't take back the land by making war on the Europeans and bombing the hell out of them and making them leave, they negotiate their way out. And in this negotiation process, we'll talk here specifically about Ghana and Brazil, the two cases that we want to put some emphasis on this evening. When Ghana negotiates its way out of enslavement and colonization, it does so by accepting something called the Westminster model of government. That is to say, the way they would go on in this independence they had acquired was by using the apparatus the Europeans had brought them. And so there too, you see, even independence comes with some degree of peril. They are accepting the very terms on which their land has been occupied. They are accepting the terms by which the occupation was carried out in order to be, as it were, independent. Brazil does rather worse, actually. Now, the interesting thing is that its independence comes long before independence comes to Ghana. It comes 100 years before. But independence for Brazil, which has been occupied by Europeans, the independence that comes is not to indigenous people in Brazil, but to the Portuguese. This is a little bit, it makes your head almost, your brain matter wither up and die, that the independence that comes to Brazil is not for its indigenous people, but it is for a Portuguese elite that has come and extended Portugal into Brazil, and they become independent in a place that they have enslaved and occupied. And if you can figure out the promise in that number, tell me about it. There is some element in this perilous moment, however, that's not too bad. And it has to do something with the USA, which after all had no formal colonies in Liberia, unless you think of in Africa, unless you think of Liberia as being a colony. But the bit of light in this process of negotiated independence comes when a United States President, Woodrow Wilson, enunciates a plan for finishing off, resolving World War I, and he says the way in which Europeans have to acknowledge that they ought to relate to each other in order to have peace is that everybody has to acknowledge the self-determination of the member states with which they're warring. And Woodrow Wilson was enunciating that plan of self-determination for Europeans. Not the colonized Africans, not the colonized Asians, but Nehru and W.E.B. Du Bois and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam try to get to that table where the settlement is being wrought to give European self-determinations to say, we colonized Africans and Asians should be susceptible to having self-determination too. And so they use this as the means to work to a point in World War II when it's absolutely obvious to the Europeans that the game is going to be over for them, and so they're either going to just have to walk out the door or negotiate their way out to have some saving grace. But this notion of self-determination turns out to be great promise for Africans and other people similarly situated in Asia. Latin America independence has come already, so they are not a part of this moment. But what comes out of it that's useful for the major theme, I take it from Michael Williams' presentation, is that there is a movement for unity of colonized people who are similarly situated, and that's the theme of the Third World, where Nehru in India says, the thing we ought to do is to all get together, and it will be easier for fighting our way back to independence again. And so that comes out of this, the prospects for unity, and we can talk some about that in the Q&A. Another interesting moment that comes out of it, and it was at the tail end of Michael's presentation, and it's about the diaspora, African descendants dispersed largely in the Americas from Canada down to South America. And that is the elements of Africa's culture that have been exported to the Western world and adapted. The ways in which African descendants learn to survive in the new world, as it were, by bringing efforts of their African culture, Africanisms, with them, and to the extent to which Europeans make their own adaptations from those elements of African culture that are exported, it becomes just another means of Africans acquiring some benefits of the forced migration of its people to this side. And it's the extent to which African descendants act to take some responsibility for the African continental condition. And there have been a variety of movements, activities, efforts that we can talk about that have been valuable, starting most prominently with W.E.B. Du Bois, but there are lots of those that we can talk about as some element of promise in this very early globalization process. Well, I want to make talk at two other points, and then I will be done. One of the other perilous arrangements that arrive for Africa and African descendants as a result of the moments of enslavement and colonization is that Africa becomes dependent in a global world on a relationship with Europeans that's asymmetrical. Africa is left with widespread dependence on Europe in so many ways as a result of these two early moments of globalization. I just want to share a few examples of how this works and why it's so tricky to come out of it really with benefits. It may surprise, well, it won't surprise you to know that one of the ways in which the colonial apparatus worked was the African colony. Let's play like we're talking about Ghana here, which was an Anglophone colony. It was colonized by Britain. And the way the relationships worked that structured Ghana's peace in a globalized world all went through London. Telephone calls, if you had to make a telephone call from Accra in Ghana to Abidjan in a Francophone country next door, That call had to be routed through London, then through Paris, before it could get back to Abidjan in Ivory Coast, just next door. So this dependency relationship suggests that everything about the way colonialism worked was designed to detract from the possibility of unity between African countries. If you've got to go through all that rigmarole just to make a telephone call to the guy next door to you, there is something about the possibilities for unity that are screwed up. And so it was not easy for these two countries to talk to each other. And now that independence has come, it's fraught with that kind of background. And so today, it's much easier for Ghanaians to talk to Nigerians than it is to talk to the country next door. The language factor being just one of them. And so this example of the dependency relationship, another is, where does Ghana's cocoa go when it enters the marketplace these days? The first market that was created for Ghana's cocoa was in London. And so the price for the cocoa was set there, and if the Europeans decided they wanted to pay less for the chocolate that they had produced from the cocoa, well, it was the cocoa farmer in Ghana who suffered, because the price per pound was going down. So it is these kind of dependent relationships. As much cocoa as Ghana has today, it does not control the pricing. As much oil as Ghana has today, and yes, it does have some oil, it does not control the pricing. It also does not control the technology, because it doesn't have enough engineers to develop and process the oil, and the refining goes somewhere else anyway, and then Ghana has to buy it back from a manufacturing a country that's got that kind of technology. So dependency turns out to be perilous. Well, the last point I want to make is that, so we're in a globalized world now, and it started a long time ago. And it looks like once you get in it, you can't really go back. There is something unilinear about this globalization business. In fact, it probably isn't desirable to go back from it. And I want to give some examples of why that is. If one takes Ebola as an example, if we did not now exist in that globalized world that allows the disease to travel that Michael has sketched so nicely here, if we didn't live in a globalized world, we would not have the opportunity to use the benefits of science and technology that's worldwide, exists mostly outside of Africa, that would help us to find the resolution to that medical problem. Africa, let's play like we could stop globalization. With the event of Ebola, Africa could not resolve that problem all by itself. After all, with more Ghanaian doctors operating in New York City than in Accra, that gives you a part of the reason why Africa couldn't resolve it if we stopped globalization. So it is a process that looks unilinear, and there are all kinds of beneficial ways in which we can grow and develop as a process of being in a process of globalization. Well, let me just end up by, I wanted to say rather more about Ghana and Brazil, so let me just suggest some things that perhaps we can talk about if there's world enough in time. And that is, so what does Ghana and Brazil look like today? Both countries having experienced these two horrible moments of disablement from early globalization. What do they look like now, and what are their prospects like? Ghana, despite everything, is now a fairly stable two-party system country. They have, since 1992, I think it is, had these two parties that vie against each other in this kind of stable arrangement. People sort of expect that this is what the parties are going to be, and they have to be in one tent or the other, and people pretty much accept that that's the way the game is played, and a certain sort of stability of the political system has arrived from that. Ghana's recent discovery of oil, even though oil in a country like Ghana, we political scientists say, is a kind of curse. It's a curse that's better to have than not have, and so there are going to be some benefits from Ghana, and I think Ghana has learned something from the Nigerians in the management of a great deal of oil. It is, I think everybody recognizes, been fairly poorly managed in Nigeria, and Ghana is trying to learn something from that. And interestingly, Nigerians are helping Ghana to learn from this. Some Nigerians have been involved in the engineering process. After all, Nigeria's got more engineers than anybody else in Africa, more capacity than anybody else in Africa to do almost anything. And so they are helping the Ghanaians to learn, but there is still danger in a country that ends up with a lot of oil. So despite everything, Ghana is not the worst off place, the most worst off place in Africa one could be. Brazil, similarly, is a huge place, a huge economy, but there may be more ambivalence in this place for African descendants, at least, because of the scale and scope of what Brazil is. It's a country that's industrial. One has to say is on the cusp of having an industrial revolution. So big is its industrial sector now, and so linked is it to the countries that are too big to fail, like the USA and Germany, that when the economy sneezes in the USA, Brazil feels that now. And because of the placement of African descendants in Brazil, which the country is beginning to acknowledge that there's a hell of a lot of African descendants there. I mean, there was a point in time that in Brazil you could talk about people as anything other than African descendants, but there's beginning to be some recognition that there's a huge number of African descendants there now, but their placement in the society suggests that they really are outside of the major benefits of this booming economy, and that is something that one has, the country has to attend to, that makes the card on Brazil ambivalent. They've done a number of things that are interesting in causing public debate right now. Brazil has, one can talk about affirmative action in Brazil today. You almost can't talk about it in the USA anymore without being clobbered by some people who are having another tea party after 300 years. But you can actually utter the word in Brazil today. It's a public policy supported by the government and so on. Brazil is now in its second cycle of a leftist government, and I don't want to make a prognostication about the outcome in the runoff, but there is the possibility that a leftist government will continue. It has in some senses been more responsive for the first time, frankly, to African descendants by the name. And so the ambivalence that I refer to in Brazil is not total, but these are two examples of two places that this globalization process that we have talked about here this evening have had more peril than promise for Africans or African descendants. I will stop there, and you can talk back at us. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dr. Morrison. When I was finishing up my PowerPoint to bring down here, all of a sudden I had a fatal error. And I quickly reached for my smartphone to Google what to do, and it said, call Microsoft. And I thought back to the words of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who said, do for self. In my case, I actually got Rochelle to help me, our program analyst for compliance and all-around IT person. She actually saved our PowerPoint. But when talking about Africa and Brazil, and talking about Africa and Brazil in the context of globalization, as you both very, very clearly and concisely laid out, we have to talk about not just Ebola, but what's happening now. And for my students who are here who said, why are we studying Ebola 3.5 weeks ago? Now we know why we're studying it. So my answer to them then is the same answer that we've had tonight, in which case Africa is just a plane ride, or two, depending on which carrier you take away. That has been brought home to us very closely. So with that, if we can have our distinguished panel talk about how real, in your mind, do you think Ebola was to the average U.S. citizen, and how real is it now for those of us who are here, since the first diagnosed case in the U.S. was here in Texas? Do you think that put it in perspective? And if so, if Dr. Williams can tell us a little about what was the global coverage of it like?
Oh, great. Well, yeah, I was initially happy that, not happy, I thought it would benefit everybody by the case in Dallas. I thought this experience would serve to provide more information, more facts about Ebola. And I think that has occurred and not occurred. Because when you study the media, there's still a lot of hysteria.
Is that right? Oh, still a lot of hysteria and misinformation. So it hasn't really, to me, provided more factual information. In some ways, it's to intensify the hysteria because a lot of information is not coming out. Now, relatedly, it would have been a great opportunity, the Ebola crisis in the United States and elsewhere, for us to talk about real health problems in Africa. One of the things we should know that even if the 20,000 deaths from Ebola occurs, as the WHO has predicted, it still is much less than the amount of people who die from malaria every year. Imagine now, Ebola is They claim it, WHO expects 20,000 by January. But that 20,000, in West Africa, that 20,000 would represent 0.00005 of the population in West Africa, which is 400 million. Malaria kills 1 million a year. 3,000 African children die every day. Imagine, every day. It's like equivalent of 3,000 children being put in a jet plane and just crashing every day. But there's no talk of it. So I was hoping that, the Ebola crisis, and it would just open up dialogue. The HO knows this question of malaria, but it hasn't. It just seems to, one of the things that's coming out is banning people from coming and all this kind of crap. So it's been good and bad, I think, recently, the Ebola media coverage.
And if you don't mind, Dr. Morrison, your perspective.
Well, I agree. I think the primary assumption that Americans initially made was that this was a disease, another disease in Africa for Africans, and that it didn't have a great deal to do with us over here. And it is interesting when the reality comes home about the true nature of the global world, it immediately creates hysteria amongst Americans. There is the assumption now that if you walk out your door, you are going to get it. And if you encounter Africans anywhere, you are going to get it. And the unfortunate thing about this is that none of the hysteria contributes to resolution of the problem. Instead, we have already seen, and this is likely to get worse, the kinds of public responses and demands from the public, the American public, about what we must do to protect ourselves from this disease, and it will do with travel and transport and all the rest of it, which is just another piece of the hysteria that I think is, outsized, and we don't begin to talk about the ways in which this could be a moment when we could make a fundamental contribution to the development and enhancement of healthcare systems in Africa. And we don't really get to have that conversation because we have to spend so much time dealing with public perceptions, and perceptions create public policy. Public officials will have to respond to demands from the public for safety. We were just talking when we were coming downstairs about how Homeland Security is a growth industry in universities everywhere today. And that has followed 9/11. It's a matter of public policy that we have made financial investments into the study of Homeland Security. And not every university, but many universities have programs in this now growth industry.
When you talk about growth industries and education, it certainly makes us think about Brazil. I think we've talked about the Brazilian Scientific Mobility Program, which is Brazil's initiative to send 100,000 of their scholars to study abroad. They are in year 3 of this initiative, and the Brazilian Scientific Mobility Program has been considered successful. But what are some lessons that Africa, the continent, or even Ghana or some of the countries within could take from this initiative? Is there a lesson to using oil and gas revenues and using it to fuel education? Is that a relatively new concept in some parts of the continent?
Yeah, well, let me first say something about the Brazilian initiative to create scientists and STEM-trained people as it relates to African descendants. It's a huge program with huge investments, but my Afro-Brazilian friends and colleagues have not seen that it's been largely responsive to needs of training people in STEM fields amongst Afro-Brazilians. So that's
Absolutely
that's a
true.
point.
That's statistically true, absolutely.
Now, what Africans or Ghanaians, now with their oil money, might learn from this model that the Brazilians have put on the table is how to make investments in their own society for training people in STEM fields. Now, and Ghana and African countries in general have huge advantages here. And that is that there isn't the inherent fear of the study of STEM fields in those countries that exist in the USA. I mean, one of the scariest things in higher education in the US is the fear that our students have of doing math and science. There's no inherent fear like that in the Ghanaian universities. Lots of well-trained scientists in the university and so on, and people study sciences. So maximizing that by putting resources from oil proceeds into that would be a real advantage for the country.
I don't have anything to add. I think I'll defer to what Prof has just said, yeah.
To flip the coin then, are there some things that perhaps that Ghana or even the continent of Africa could teach Brazil? I found it striking in the last election that one of the three major candidates, Marina, as she's called, La Marina, as they call her in Brazil, was the first major political candidate, most presidential national candidate of African descent. But when they did polling, the overwhelming majority of Afro-Brazilians, or the Brazilians that we would identify as having the strongest being of African descent, had no context of understanding even how to support a candidate that looked like them. She's actually the daughter of rubber pickers, as they call them, in northern Brazil, in Salvador, in the Bahian state. But is there not a lesson that then perhaps Africa could teach Brazil about electing those that look like themselves? Is there not an inherent lesson about the lingering effects of colonization? And if so, what thoughts may we have on that?
That's a loaded question, huh?
Yeah.
Those are the ones I asked, sir.
Well, I don't know. I would approach it a different angle. I don't know if Africa has anything, because we don't, I mean, in Ghana, Africa, everybody is black, kind of, so unlike Brazil, Brazil has that kind of biracial, multi-ethnic environment. So I don't know if this is you can compare it well. Africa has so many racial problems. It's a racial tinderbox. You might not think it because everybody's African, but you take, for example, in Ghana and throughout the continent, there's a huge effort to bleach. Bleaching is a major problem. I mean, women mostly, but the people in general will risk getting cancer just to look light. So the similarities are there. It has to do with the global phenomenon of race and white privilege and white preference. That, I don't know if Africa has any lesson to, if it's a lesson, it's just what not to do. Because honestly,
Yeah, I agree that the proposition may not work because the element of class which interferes in Brazil is also present in Ghana. And
Tribalism, ethnicism.
color doesn't really mediate it. It is just as important. So the comparison may be the USA and Brazil. There may be lessons there, and in fact, I think Afro-Brazilians would say that one of the things that animates them in thinking about engaging as African descendants, as Afro-Brazilians, is looking at what's happening in the North, in the USA. They were enamored with what happened in our Black Power movement, and in fact, the Black movement in Brazil gets off around about the same time. They look at who some of the prominent figures are. Malcolm X and so on is an important figure to them, Stokely Carmichael. So I think in some ways Afro-Brazilians might argue that that's really the comparative example. And here again, class does get in the way. I mean, a part of what was complicated about the fact that Marina, that you had a bona fide black candidate in the race for president of Brazil, and in fact, most of us in this room may not know that. That
A number of Brazilians didn't know that.
well,
Dr.
that's
Morrison,
right,
yes.
that it wasn't articulated that way in the campaign in Brazil tells you something. It would have been unlikely in the USA to have had, for Barack Obama to have been seen other than an African descendant candidate. It just couldn't happen here that he would be seen as
an American.
Yeah, or Hawaiian, Asian Hawaiian.
Kaplan Asian, to use Tiger's term.
Yes, a la Tiger Woods. It just would not have been possible for him ever to have been seen that way as a candidate. We could only have understood him as a bona fide African descendant candidate. And yet in Brazil, you could have a woman who self-identifies, and it is not in the main articulated that way in the public space. So I suppose the lesson is that the sort of model in the USA that privileged seeing ourselves in a highly racialized way and acting it out to suggest to Brazilians that it is possible to do that. Now, when you look at the politics on the ground, so to speak, it gets really messy. Dilma Rousseff has been the person who has articulated the public policy that provides more benefits to Afro-Brazilians than anybody else has provided before. Marina didn't, well, we couldn't really tell what Silva put on the table in terms of a platform for responding to Afro-Brazilians, because she wanted to be seen as the environmental, the green,
She was guarding it.
and that was the way it was run. So it is complicated and messy, and but you know, so she ran. That's an important for Brazil, that you can get a black candidate who is fielded as a party's standard bearer for president in a country that 20 years ago, blackness was a residual category. There were 160 other things you could be in terms of self-identification in Brazil other than black. To be black was something residual.
I believe in our EMPA trip in 2011, was that, when we met with the Brazilian census? The Brazilian census official came and spoke to the EMPA program when we traveled to Brazil. And they've now narrowed it down to 138 categories.
Oh, well, that's something.
That you can self-identify on the census. My favorite was toasted almond, which is what I'm going to start using for myself. Cinnamon, ruddy, freckled, motley. There were 138 from caramel to all variations of white, vanilla, literally 138 of them. And so when you have a country that has 138 ways to express race and color on the census, to even have a candidate with an Afro-Brazilian background could be seen as progress, progress,
Well,
as we take the steps that we can.
Yeah.
I think some have said that there were some parallels to the Ghanaian situation in Ghana, certainly, and I believe Dr. Williams mentioned there is one race, but there's certainly ethnicism, there's tribalism that comes into play in terms of presidential candidacies and voting themselves as large blocks vote. Actually, there's quite a bit of research about that, some of which both of you have done, about voting specifically in Ghana and the lessons from that. So it's certainly something that I think the world would be looking at and continuing to look at. When we first went to Brazil after Barack Obama was elected, people said, we can't imagine a black president, a black candidate, much less a black president in Brazil. They found it just fascinating. And then we had a viable candidate this year who came very close to making the runoff. So that could be seen as some progress. But we do wonder what those lessons are.
Yeah, well, with ethnicity, one of the things in Ghana, you're right, that's a great divide. But unfortunately, leaders use that divide to advance their own interests. Colonialism fossilized people at the ethnic level, groups at the ethnic level, fossilized them at the tribal level, and then forced them under one geopolitical roof, rivals. So it's been very difficult to achieve national integration. Still a problem in Africa today, political stability, and then economic development. So I don't know much about the Brazilian case, but I know it's a major factor of division. I mean, it's one of the major impediments, obstacles to the Pan-African unity that we talked about earlier. And it's a great divide. It's 100 and... No, I'm thinking of borders. It's just so many ways to divide African ethnicity is one, and we just have to somehow find a way to transcend it. Kwame Nkrumah did a great job by just promoting that we are Ghanaian people. Ghana has ethnic tension, conflict, but not on the level that you find in other parts of Africa, and I think largely because Nkrumah didn't promote his own ethnic group, but rather looked at the basic needs in Ghana and found that they were greater in the north, and did everything he could to try to make the North catch up with the rest of the country. But his own group, he literally ignored. He's in eczema. So I think that's a lesson for development, at least in Africa, that the ethnic divide needs to be addressed seriously. Otherwise, we're just not going forward.
I completely agree that the person of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and in the history of the movement for unification in Africa is of monumental importance. I think that Kwame Nkrumah existed in Ghana has literally saved the life of Ghana as a political entity. That they model, and I think it took Ghanaians a long time to accept and understand the importance of what he was talking. He was dead already before every political party of any stripe in Ghana realized the importance of appropriating his ideas. And almost every party now in Ghana wants to claim Nkrumah. He absolutely, profoundly rejected any notion that ethnicity had something to do with the values in the modern state and as the means of bidding for public goods. Ghanaians, he was overthrown for those notions, and it takes them almost 50 years to realize the importance of that model. And I think it explains why countries all around Ghana can fall apart and Ghana does not, is this model of Kwame Nkrumah. And you know, actually thinking about it in this way, that is a value that Ghana has to offer, not just to Brazil, but to the notion of a United Nations of the world, is something that Nkrumah put on the table and was so strong in it. And of all the things that could be said about his foibles and faults, that's something you can't take away. That model of unity.
Do we have some questions here? We've got two great minds here to pose questions to. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you both for coming. It's been very enlightening. I just want to ask, well, there's a bunch of questions I want to ask, but I guess I'll just do one. So I'm just wondering, as far as economics and sustainability, you talk about developing the Congo and things like that. And the last figures I heard is a couple $1 trillion worth of resources, technological things for cell phones, things like that in the Congo. So how can you balance developing the Congo without destroying? I mean, I know that's sort of an ongoing thing, but how can you balance developing the Congo and the rest of Africa without actually destroying it at the same time? Because the Chinese are in there, other countries want to come in there and develop it, but how can you protect it at the same time, you know, extract the resources and of course let the people get the value from those resources as well?
Yeah. It's a hard problem, and it's made more difficult because of the deficit in African leadership at this moment. I think one of the disadvantages in African leadership, and I don't want to paint every African leader as being in this category, but there is significant enough corruption in African leadership that it's a problem for getting this balance right. And perhaps Congo is the best example because it is so rich. It's got so much stuff. It is such vast wealth. And since its independence, it has never had sufficient enough stability to corral that wealth and control any element of it, really. And so if you don't have some degree of control over your resources, you can't get the balance right. And so, you know, Congo is a long story, but it all goes back to the moment with Lumumba and the crisis that occurred in the way the colonial power tucked their tails and ran from the country, and it left an array of class, ethnic interests there that was bound to lead to the internecine battles that were set up. So you raise a very important question to which there isn't an easy answer, but I think better leadership is a part of what's required.
Yeah, I think I agree with Prof. that Africa suffers from a huge bankruptcy of leadership. It's just useless, honestly. They've just been siphoning off all the money, and it's been like that for, goodness, from almost the very beginning, with some exception. Those leaders who were committed, of course, they were the victims of a coup d'etat or assassination. Lumumba, of course, Nkrumah. For me, I'd start with education and women. We need the Pan-Africanism that I think we need has to start from the bottom up. This AU is just Pan-Africanism from the top, and that's really problematic for reasons that we've just talked about. So the youth, I think, are ready. We have to educate the youth, and I'm a strong believer in this education. This ethnic issue can be solved largely through education. You know, you just teach and train people that we're all the same. So it's long term. It's not anything that's going to occur overnight. But then there's women. They can really, circumvent or undermine the ethnic problem. Because when there's ethnic wars, ethnic cleansing, ethnic conflict, it's women and children who are the first victims, honestly, in the Congo. This destruction you're talking about, with the coltan, which is used for the telephones and the laptops, it's women who are the first victims. But if you look at the history of conflict resolvement, you'll find women playing a major part. Because this ethnic war cleansing, it's men. Women, not that they're saints and all, but they have a difficult time killing people along just on ethnicity. If you look at Liberia's conflict was resolved primarily from women. Women, in fact, a couple of them won the peace, this thing.
The Nobel Peace Prize, yes.
Because, in fact, it resolved itself in Ghana. Because they had a big meeting at the Accra conference, and the women told the men, look, don't come out until you resolve it, otherwise we're going naked. And they were going to take all their clothes off, and that's a huge embarrassment for African men. But they created organizations that transcended ethnicity and religion. That organization in Liberia of women, and Sierra Leone you find much the same, they were of different ethnic groups, different religion. Women can do that easier. They do it easier than men. And so I think the key is with women to help solve the problem. After all, they're over 50% of the population, and you just like running a race with everybody else has track shoes on and you running with concrete boots by oppressing and keeping the women down. Women are the key. They know all the problems. They need to be in all the parliamentary they need to be represented very well in the parliamentary sector, and this is where we should focus: the youth, education for me, and the liberation of women.
Quite famously, I think Nkrumah said, when they asked about his Egyptian wife, he said, whatever group I would have picked a wife from, whatever ethnic group, would have seemed to be favoring that group. So the choice of an Egyptian wife seemed like a very Catholic meaning universal choice. So it goes back to Pan-Africanism as well. Another question? Any other questions? So one of the things we talk about in my class is that Africa has been the world's ATM machine for a while. And we use that terminology because literally we've been getting money out of this ATM machine. But we know what happens to an ATM if it's never reloaded, if it's never refilled, if it's not serviced. And we have not serviced this vast ATM machine for a while. If you guys don't mind, I'd like to go ahead and thank Dr. Morrison. Can we thank Dr. Williams for their time?
Thank you also.
And of course, our host, Dr. Michael Adams, who's going to wrap up for us.
What an amazing discussion. Not so long ago, I used to tell Dr. Morrison that I wanted his job. I was actually offered a job at Tougaloo, but I ended up in Houston. He may remember that, right? But I still get all of my inspiration from him. And certainly, I've known Dr. Michael Williams for several years, and we've become close friends. And for all of my students, I think what we've seen tonight is very exemplar of what you can be in terms of your intellect. And so again, on that note, thank you. And also for my fellow Tougalooans and good friends. And I was telling Casey earlier, I have one, Beverly Miller, and I can't, she's the best friend of my sister and also her soror. So greetings again, and thank you for coming. Bye.
Yeah, I like this. It's good. So it's recorded, huh? The whole thing.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, you recorded the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
That's live stream.
Well, how long you in town for? Yeah. You know, that's where...
You know that I'm in Stark.
Yeah, I saw that reply. You opened an apartment up there.
Yes.
But that's where all of my family comes from, on my dad's side.
Oh, you?
Yeah.